You boys be quiet down there!
Welcome back to PC-88 Paradise, the series where we take a close look at classic games for the NEC PC-88, the most popular Japanese PC series of the 1980s. Snatcher, the cult classic graphic adventure game from Metal Gear director Hideo Kojima. In the West, it may be best known for the 1994 English language version on Sega CD, a famously high-priced collector's item. But the original version of Snatcher was made way back in 1988 for the NEC PC-88. This version, I would say, isn't especially rare. I see it on the used market in Japan pretty frequently. It is, however, a well-known and desirable game, and prices have started to climb toward the $200 range recently. The inside of the case has a cool Konami logo embedded in the plastic, and below it you can see a sticker which was originally used to seal the game. Here we have a registration card and small advertisement flyer. On one side it shows other Konami titles available, like Mad City for Famicom, the Japanese version of Bayou Billy, Konamic Tennis for Famicom Disk, and Kings Valley 2 for MSX. On the other side it shows a number of animated VHS tapes Konami released. It's important to remember that Konami isn't just a game company. For instance, today they own one of the largest gym chains in Japan. The manual is printed in black and white and green. If you open it from the front, it's a short manual detailing how to play the game, but on the back it says Concept Material Collection, and has the illustration later used as the cover for the Sega CD version. Open from this side and we get a manga drawn by character designer Tomiharu Kinoshita. The style is very obviously influenced by Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira. The remainder of the manual is filled with concept art and materials related to the making of the game. What really impresses me is how fleshed out the details of the world are here. It's not even necessary for us to know that this world has dragon horse racing, or a new sport called Confused Ball, but the information is here nonetheless. Finally, the floppy disks. Gotta love these sleeves. Konami, joy of game. The game is stored on 5 disks, which consist of the system disk and 4 scenario disks. To start the game, you insert the system disk in drive 1 and scenario disk 1 in drive 2. We begin with the familiar Konami logo, as well as a disclaimer that the characters and events are fictional. Then the logo for Team Metal Slave, which was the name of Kojima's development team at the time. In the English Sega CD version, the game is dedicated to cyberpunks, but in Japanese, it's cyberpunkers. We are presented immediately with a menu. Press 0 for a new game, or 1 to continue a saved game. Start a new game and we can choose to enter a name for the protagonist. I'll just keep it the default, Gillian Seed. The option to rename your character was removed for the console versions because those include voiced dialogue, and they needed to be able to say the character's name aloud. The opening begins in Moscow, 1991, where an explosion releases a biological weapon, killing half the world's population. For the Sega CD version, they pushed all the dates back by 5 years to keep them in the future, but interestingly, they didn't bother doing that for any of the Japanese console versions, despite the date already being in the past by the time those were released. Anyway, half a century later, cyborgs of an unknown origin called Snatchers begin appearing. They kill their targets and then take their places, unbeknownst to the people around them. The look and sound of this title sequence here was imitated to some extent in all later versions of the game. Then we get the credits sequence and the setting of the game is introduced. Neo Kobe City 2042. The setting and theme of the game is very obviously influenced by the movie Blade Runner. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the world of Snatcher practically is the world of Blade Runner.
There's a ton of references in the game that sort of skirt copyright laws. I never worried about that back then, because doing what I liked in games, an interactive form of media, was in itself a new thing for me. Hideo Kojima.
Next, the protagonist is introduced. Gillian Seed, age 31. He and his wife were found in Siberia 3 years ago, both suffering from amnesia. The two are now estranged and can't remember anything from before they were found. Starting today, Gillian has joined the Junkers, an organization dedicated to hunting snatchers. Overall, the opening is quite cinematic and very impressive for 1988. The music is also great. The decision to use the PC-88's more advanced soundboard too is much appreciated. Plenty of PC-88 games from this time didn't bother supporting this new sound hardware and stuck with the old monaural soundboard, which most people were still using at the time. At the end of the opening sequence, we're asked to insert Disc 4 in Drive 2. By Disc 4, it means Scenario Disc 4, which we'll use to replace Scenario Disc 1 currently in the drive, and press space. Gillian arrives at Junker HQ, and the game begins. After the impressive opening sequence, I was actually kind of surprised how old the PC-88 version of Snatcher feels. That may sound funny since we're talking about an 8-bit PC game from the 80s here, but as someone who's played a lot of PC-88 games, I've gotta say I was actually expecting a bit of a more modern interface from a game released this late in the system's life. The game feels very rooted in adventure games from the earlier parts of the 80s.
I wanted to make an adventure game like the Portopia Serial Murder Case, a game I was into during my college years. While planning out Snatcher, Enix put out another game titled Jesus. When I saw Jesus, I was convinced that I had to develop Snatcher for the PC-8801, or it wouldn't be good. It was ultimately released a year and a half behind schedule.
In Snatcher, you select commands by pressing the appropriate number on the keyboard rather than toggling. The corresponding numbers for each command frequently change as the number of available options increases or decreases. For instance, say you want to keep using the investigate command here until you've gone through all the options available to investigate, so you keep pressing 2 every time you get back to the main menu, but then suddenly investigate is now 3. You've really got to look carefully at this menu to make sure you press the right key, and unlike in the console versions, there's no way to skip the text or speed it up, so you've got to wait for this all to finish before you can get back to the main menu and you can finally select the option you actually wanted. All of this, along with the slow disk access time, combines to make the game feel pretty old, but to be fair, this is definitely not the only 1988 adventure game that uses this sort of interface, and there are certainly others that feel even older. But come on, this is Konami. The modern-looking packaging and opening got my expectations up a bit too high, I guess. It can also be a very quiet game. If you've played one of the newer versions, you might be surprised to learn that there's no background music at Junker HQ, and in many other scenes in the PC-88 game. Much of the time, you'll only be hearing these sound effects used to indicate characters speaking, which vary in pitch depending on the character. These can be turned on or off with the caps lock key. But what Snatcher lacks in interface and sound, it more than makes up for in atmosphere. Something about the simple 8-bit graphics and lack of voices makes the game feel far more creepy on PC-88 than it does in any of the console versions. Even in safe areas of the game like HQ and Gillian's house, I always had a weird feeling of unease. There is some simple animation in many of the scenes here on the PC-88 that looks quite nice, and when there is music, it complements the creepy atmosphere quite well. At HQ, you'll meet Gillian's ever-present robot companion, Metal Gear Mark II, supposedly named after the supercomputer that posed a threat to the world in the late 20th century. This seems to hint that Snatcher and Metal Gear might take place in the same universe, but there are events in Snatcher, such as the biological weapon catastrophe in 1991, that don't fit the timeline of the later Metal Gear games. Metal Gear Mark II, in contrast to the original, is a cute character who often provides comic relief, and who will allow you to save your game. Up to 3 saves can be stored on the game's system disk, which you'll notice is not write protected. The game unfortunately doesn't allow the option of a user disk or provide any simple method to make a backup of the system disk. In addition to the front reception, there are 5 locations to visit at Junker HQ before your first assignment suddenly comes up, assisting the other Junker on staff. Geez, considering how well known the Junkers seem to be in this city, you'd think they'd have more than a couple Junkers on staff. Never mind. In Snatcher, sometimes it's best to just indulge Kojima's plot and get swept up in its world. Better not to ask too many questions. For the shooting parts, you need to hold shift to draw your blaster, then use the number keys on the keyboard to shoot at each of the 9 squares on screen. The console versions adapted this to be played using a D-pad, and famously, the Sega CD version even allows you to use the Konami Justifier light gun.
An oversized handgun called the Justifier. And what does this game seem to teach our kids? Basically, that a gun can solve any problem.
So even though you're using a light gun that can aim anywhere on the screen, the play area is divided into only 9 possible sections to aim at. Gillian and his wife Jamie are separated, but you're able to call Jamie on the video phone during the game and check in with her. One option allows you to ask her out on a date, but no matter which venue you propose, Jamie says that she's not ready. You're free to come off as desperate as you choose here.
Jamie, please.
Then there's a part near the beginning where you need to visit the house of fellow junker John Jack Gibson. His daughter Katrina asks you how old her father is, as proof that you're really a junker. You then have to use the computer at Junker HQ to look up Gibson's name and bring up his profile. In the console versions, using the on-screen menu to type in and search a person's name is pretty straightforward, as long as you can read katakana anyway. But in the PC-88 version, you have to use the keyboard to type.
J.
Unfortunately, you can only use kana input, an antiquated method of inputting Japanese. Nowadays, I and most people input Japanese using Romaji input, which means you basically just type the Japanese words in the alphabet. But older Japanese people who learned to type on word processors or older PCs like the PC-88 learned the kana input method. And so even to this day, Windows supports kana input. And you can see this modern USB keyboard I have connected to the PC-88 using an adapter still has the kana keys labeled in addition to the alphabet. To me, this layout makes no logical sense at all. I have to hunt and peck in order to input anything. It says I have to enter a full name. Why is it, by the way, that John Jack Gibson is the only character in the game who has a middle name? Okay, anyway, she. Found it. Now I need to figure out how to add a 1010. Okay. Ya. Crap. Does this need to be a small ya? Damn, come on, I need to input this name so I can save the city from Snatchers. Oh, you hold shift to input small characters. That works. Where the hell is Okay, I sure hope this doesn't need these dots between the names, because I can't find any way to input those. Two. Where the hell is 2? Who came up with this layout? So anyway, I managed to input the name and find out the girl's father's age. Great, but after that, she still doesn't trust Gillian. Next, she asks what her 3 sizes are. What? Her clothing measurements? Why would a girl ask a strange man her clothing measurements in order to figure out if she can trust him? So we have to go all the way back to the computer at Junker HQ again and look up her file too. In the PC-88 version, moving from one location to another is a big deal. Not only does the disk access take a while, but you have to change the scenario disk in Drive 2 almost every time you move to a different location. By the way, Gillian's flying car, called a turbocycle in the English version, is actually called a tricycle in the Japanese versions. Can you imagine Gillian riding around Neo Kobe on a tricycle? But to be fair, the word tricycle can mean different things in some countries. For instance, in the Philippines, where a motorcycle with a sidecar is called a tricycle. So we finally get inside the house. In Japanese versions of the game, Katrina was originally 14, but her age was increased to 18 in the English translation. That's probably for the best. As with all the female characters in the game, you're allowed to choose actions to make Gillian flirt or act in creepy ways. I want to believe that this is just the game giving you the freedom to mess around, and not really in line with Gillian's character. Gillian's relationship with the female leads takes an even more awkward turn in a scene that they added to the end of the Sega CD version, by the way. We have to use an old computer at the house to read a floppy disk we found earlier. In the PC-88 version, the computer is a PC-88. Unlike in the console versions, the disk is password protected. The password apparently is only 1 key long. That's not much of a password. I don't know what to press. I'm pretty sure I haven't found a password anywhere in the game yet. After a few random tries, Metal Gear Mark II makes a suggestion. Maybe the scrap of paper Gibson left behind that says search home has something to do with it. So in the original version of the game, this clue has an additional meaning. It means not only to search his home, but it's also the password for the disc. Home, house? I don't know what to press. There's a key marked home on this keyboard, but the keyboard adapter I'm using maps this key to the clear screen key on a real PC-88 keyboard. Pressing this key is not going to work. Whoa, it worked. It says I pressed the home key. So the reason why this works is because this key was originally called the home clear key on earlier PC-88 models, like the popular Mark II SR, but still by the time this game was released, some PC-88 models had the new type keyboards where this key was labeled clear screen in Japanese instead. So I imagine people who had those models must have been pretty stumped here, unless they knew this key used to be called home clear. This is the same game where you have to do things like call phone numbers that appear in the background. A lot of it seems to be designed to stump the player for a while, and then make them feel smart when they finally figure it out. The game holds the player's hand a lot less than the console versions, where, for instance, you automatically take items as needed by looking at and examining them. In the PC-88 version, there's a take command that appears even when there's nothing to take. On almost every screen, you can attempt to take objects like neon signs or furniture if you want, only to be told you can't take it. Later on in Act 1, your investigation leads you to Club Outer Heaven, where it's currently Masquerade Hour. All the patrons and staff are in costume, including the doorman.
This is El Wolfjam with Body Slam.
For the Sega CD version released in the West, all the legally distinct characters from other recognizable properties were changed to Konami characters. The English version works in some comments about Konami games here, and a jab at the senators from that hearing I showed earlier, saying they were all voted out of office. In the PC Engine and Sega CD remake, a voice sample plays on repeat here, demanding to know, when are you going home?
When are you going home?
Club Outer Heaven, where your only question will be, when do we leave? Apparently, a world-famous hologram star, Isabella, is performing here, and you're able to get her attention simply by yelling at the stage, because game. Here's another part of the game I found especially difficult. You have to get a verbal description of the perp's face from Isabella, and then use it to construct a digital mock-up on the computer at HQ. I found it really difficult to tell which facial features I'm supposed to choose using the verbal descriptions. She says he had a pointy nose, like an eagle. Which one of these is supposed to be a pointy nose? Though the console versions have more features to choose from, they help the player out a bit more here and try to guide them to the right choices. None of that here in the PC-88 version. And plus, every time you submit a face to see if it's correct, you have to wait a while for this slow text to type out and tell you whether you're right or wrong. Japanese is my second language, so I did have a native Japanese speaker take a look at Isabella's facial description here, just to make sure it wasn't just me missing any important nuances. Even together, we couldn't figure out the correct combination of facial features, so I'd say this part of the game is pretty ambiguous. Anyone who actually gets arrested after a verbal facial description like this should sue. This is one part where I ended up just looking up the solution online. Anyway, unlike most of my videos, I'm not going to spoil the ending or go into much more of the plot. Snatcher's amazing story is the main point of the game, and you really ought to play some version of it for yourself. But I will say that Kojima originally planned to make Snatcher an epic story, spanning 5 or even 6 acts by some accounts. But due to the amount of time the game was taking to make, Konami forced him to cut it down to only 2. Therefore, I was expecting the original PC-88 game to feel very unfinished, but was instead surprised that by the end, it feels like a pretty substantial game for 1988, with a climax that feels like it ends where it should. There's also a 16-minute long credit sequence with an epic 20-minute music track not found in any of the remakes, beginning with the PC Engine version. The soundtrack in Snatcher had 4 composers. Masahiro Ikariko and Seiichi Fukami are both Konami veterans, but I couldn't find any other credits for S. Masuda or M. Shirakawa. Watching the same names being repeated over and over again really hammers home the fact that this game was primarily created by a very small team of people. Chief Editor for Game Scenario, H. Kojima. Game Design, H. Kojima. Scenario, H. Kojima. Adventure Flow Design, H. Kojima.
Written, directed, edited, starring, and catered by J. Prescott Sherman.
They really wanted to have a long cinematic credits sequence, even without the names to fill it. Even the credits for the MSX2 version are included here on the PC-88. The ending does leave a ton of questions unanswered though, especially regarding Gillian's past, but it was a perfect setup for a sequel, which was what Kojima had planned at the time. To explain what we got instead, let's talk about the ports. At first, the only other system Snatcher was available for was the MSX2, where it was released just a few weeks after the PC-88 version. Kojima originally planned to make the game a PC-88 exclusive.
Konami's condition was that I would also develop an MSX2 version of the game, but I was extremely pleased with that and thought, alright.
So development on this version began after development on the PC-88 was well underway. Of course, since the MSX2 uses a completely different color palette and resolution from the PC-88, the graphics had to be redrawn based on the original ones. This version came with a special cartridge which added some DRAM, as well as Konami's SCC sound chip, for greatly improved music beyond the MSX2's internal capabilities. Thus, the MSX2 has quite a good version of the soundtrack that some may argue is even better than the original PC-88 version. This is the version of the game most similar to the PC-88 original, and there is a patch by Takamichi Suzukawa and Artemio available if you'd like to play the game in English. 2 years after the original Snatcher games, Konami decided to remake the game into a turn-based RPG with cute graphics for the MSX2 called SD Snatcher. Like the original Snatcher for MSX2, it included the SCC Plus cartridge for expanded sound and DRAM. The game follows roughly the same story as the original game. Very roughly. But by this time, all plans for a Snatcher 2 had been cancelled, so Kojima decided to include a lot of additional story near the end, explaining all unanswered questions. This game also has a couple of different English patches, one of which by a group called Oasis is said to be one of the first fan translations of a game ever made. There's also a newer improved version by Project Melancholia shown in the footage here. In 1992, with the availability of CD-ROM technology, Konami decided to remake Snatcher with voice actors performing much of the dialogue on the PC Engine Super CD. Despite a much faster and easier user interface, it still follows the story of the original game almost beat for beat. This one, however, also includes an additional third act loosely based on the final events in SD Snatcher. The new third act contains very little gameplay and is mostly lengthy cutscenes. The plot moves at a breakneck speed here, which is jarring compared to the steady pace of the first two acts. Some new music tracks, including BGM for Junker HQ, were added in this version, so now the game has BGM most of the time. The CD Redbook audio music here was reused in all subsequent versions, but most of the music is PSG chiptunes in order to allow for disc access. These are rather sparse, simple arrangements even for PC Engine PSG that could have been done a little better in my opinion. Overall, this is a very well-made version of the game for its time, which sold fairly well, finally giving many players in Japan a chance to play the game for the first time. But the PC Engine wasn't a successful system in the US, where it was called the TurboGrafX, so when Konami decided to adapt the game for Western audiences, they turned to the Sega CD, the only CD-ROM based console which had much of any user base in North America and Europe. Since the Sega CD was even less successful in Japan, this version was never released in Japanese. For the most part, this is a port of the PC Engine version, though they added an additional scene in the opening based on part of the manga that came with the original game, as well as one scene in the ending. A number of other parts needed to be censored or modified to suit the US market, but the violence and gore was left intact except for a minor edit to one scene. Despite the censorship, the English Sega CD release is still decidedly an adult game, especially compared to what was the norm for Western console releases in the early 90s. If you've only ever played the Sega CD version, it might surprise you to learn that the music was given a significant overhaul from the PC Engine version. Plenty of interesting liberties were taken with the arrangements, giving it lots of that 90s Konami personality. The sound engine used at the time could sometimes even sound a bit like Castlevania Bloodlines. The Sega CD soundtrack was programmed by Osamu Kasai and Akira Soji, both with credits working on the sound in many Konami games, including ones on the Mega Drive and Sega CD. the 90s, living in the US, my local grocery store's video rental had Snatcher available for rent, so back then it wasn't exactly unobtainium, but it had a low print run, and the game's acclaim has made it a desirable title for Sega CD collectors. The last versions of Snatcher were released for the PlayStation and Saturn in Japan only in 1996. These versions feel like they were really only intended for players in Japan who hadn't already played the PC Engine version. Utilizing all the voices and CD-recorded music from that version, the only slightly upgraded graphics add little reason to play through the game again. The PCM sequencer music generated by either the PlayStation or Saturn's internal sound hardware sounds like uninspired, inoffensive elevator music, which seemed to be a trend of mid-90s era budget titles. Some of the background tunes are completely new compositions, and they're forgettable compared to the music in previous versions. The Saturn and PlayStation versions use the same basic arrangements, but the instruments used on the two consoles make them sound distinct from each other. The added CG opening based on part of the manga from the original manual also makes these versions feel very much like a product of their time. Overall, these feel like quick ports, and not nearly as impressive for their time as the PC Engine and Sega CD versions. I'd say skip them unless you have a very good reason to play them. Perhaps the reason the Saturn and PlayStation versions haven't received translation patches is because if you've played it on Sega CD, you've really already played the definitive version. Playing the original version of Snatcher on the PC-88 isn't a user-friendly experience. However, the challenge of figuring out its riddles on your own does give a feeling of accomplishment, even bigger than in the streamlined, user-friendly console versions. And the atmosphere of the 8-bit graphics and sound, in my opinion, really just can't be recreated by the technically superior console versions with their CD-ROM voices. Playing the original game with its 2 acts and cliffhanger ending makes me sad the original planned sequel never came to be. It is good that we did get closure to the story in the later versions with the 3rd act, but it feels extremely rushed and tacked on, like an extended ending to the original game. But again, I guess we're lucky to have gotten any sort of ending to the story at all.
The original Snatcher for the NEC PC-8801 was our first adventure game. We were completely fumbling our way during development, resulting in many issues, and quite frankly, it was very troublesome. On the other hand, it was also a profoundly memorable work. There were fights during the nights, staff members fell ill, and we all cried when we saw the ending. Snatcher was truly our youth. My mentality is that video games should not be something to waste time on. I want to make a game that you would want to play not just to entertain yourself when you have the time, but that will make you want to sacrifice other things in your life to spend time with it. Snatcher was made under such a concept. Even 4 years after its release, I still receive fan letters and Valentine's Day chocolates. I even get annual letters from fans updating me on their current affairs. More than a mere product, it was like a mediator that allowed me to meet new people.
Thanks for watching this episode of PC-88 Paradise. I want to give an extra special thanks to Bowl of Lentils for reading the Kojima quotes for this video. Be sure to check out his channel if you haven't already for information-packed documentaries on classic Japanese PC and console games. A special thanks as always goes to supporters on Patreon and YouTube, and thanks to everyone for liking and subscribing. This has been Mr. Jakes at Basement Brothers. I hope you'll join me again for the next video.